So today we embark on our new series of Bible talks which we've called Voyages, Navigating the Sea of Life. And in this series we're going to be looking at some of the many voyages that are found in the Bible and what they can teach us about our faith and our Christian journey. Now I grew up by the sea. From the age of 2 until my mid-30s I lived mostly in Portsmouth, which is a naval port on the south coast of England, from which Lord Nelson famously sailed in his ship, the Victory, to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. But Portsmouth also shares an island with the lovely little seaside resort of Southsea. Now you might think that someone who lived by the sea for all those years should be very at home on and in the waves, but actually you would be wrong. I didn't in fact learn to swim until I was 22. And I learnt to swim at the old Woolwich Baths in London. Furthermore, as I suffer very badly with motion sickness, I'm not great on boats of any kind. Indeed, the probability of me throwing up on a sea journey increases in proportion to the size of the waves and in inverse proportion to the size of the boat. Having said that, I still managed to become quite ill on a great big cross-channel ferry on one occasion, and that was on the shortest crossing too. However, despite not having any inclination to travel very far on it, the sea still holds a great fascination for me, as it probably does for most people on these British Isles. Whether it is watching waves lap gently onto the shore on a calm moonlit night, or seeing breakers smash over the sea defences during a storm, or just looking in awe towards the endless watery horizon, particularly when a flaming red sun disappears behind its edge, I find looking out at the sea can be both a calming and exhilarating experience. For the many people who have to travel over the sea, or indeed make their living from it, they can really come to love the sea, or at least to rely on it. And very occasionally, of course, they can be terrified by it. We can find a lot of evidence of this fascination with the sea in our popular culture and history. Growing up as a boy, I remember the sailing exploits of Sir Francis Chichester and Che Blythe. And in more recent times, I guess we all watched in 2005 as the media reported on how Dame Ellen MacArthur broke the world record for the quickest single-handed circumnavigation of the globe. And then, of course, we all tuned in our millions to the two great TV nature documentaries of recent years about the oceans, The Blue Planet in 2001 and The Blue Planet 2 in 2017. In these programmes, Sir David Attenborough reminded us that despite centuries of scientific exploration, the vast ocean depths are still largely unknown to us, and scientists are still finding new, previously undiscovered forms of life down in the deeps. The sea has also been the subject of many famous works of art, literature and music. A random selection might include Homer's great poem The Odyssey, written nearly 2,800 years ago, and bringing it a bit more up to date, in the 19th century we have Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach from 1851, Turner's famous painting Snowstorm, Steamboat off the Harbour's Mouth from 1842, and moving into the 20th century, Vaughan Williams wrote The Sea Symphony in 1909. Now if you want to listen to this wonderful evocative piece of music, please click on the link in the email and you can even follow the musical score. So how can we explain our timeless fascination with the sea? Well, perhaps it's got something to do with its sheer size. In our daily lives, most of us, certainly here in London, rarely get to see something in nature that's so huge and seemingly endless as the sea. But perhaps even more fascinating to us is the obvious power the sea possesses. Power that we can harness to create energy, but power that can also be incredibly destructive. To give you some idea of that power, I've put a couple of links in the email to some stomach-churning videos which were shot on board ships sailing in stormy seas. Now if, like me, even watching waves on a screen makes you a bit queasy, then it's probably best to give those a miss. Now some of the writers of the Old Testament, despite being part of a genuinely agricultural society, also had something of a fascination with the sea. That's not really so surprising given that one of their national borders was a coastal one on the Mediterranean, which meant that for much of their history they were importing and exporting goods by sea. However, the well-known dangers of sea travel in the ancient world gave these biblical authors a very helpful poetic way of expressing how they felt about the uncontrollable forces of nature and the threat from the hostile peoples around them. The sea makes its first appearance in the Bible in only the second verse, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. Now the Hebrew word used there for sea is tahom, often translated in English as the deep. Some scholars suggest that this sea is not like the seas we know today, but rather a cosmic sea, created by God, in which the whole earth is immersed as if waiting to be born. Here's the verse. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the face of the deep, the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. There's one school of thought that suggests that perhaps the Bible writers thought of this cosmic sea as not actually being created by God as such, but as some kind of pre-existing primordial chaos with which God had to battle in order to bring about the creation of life and order. This idea echoed the creation myths of some of the peoples that surrounded Israel when it settled in Canaan. This idea of God overcoming the chaos that threatens to destroy Israel, or even the whole human race, can be found in other parts of the Old Testament. The depictions of the raging sea and the sea monsters within it, called Rahab and Leviathan, are used as poetic devices by the Bible authors to describe the threat of enemy nations and more generally the threat of evil itself. Thus the sea is often used as a metaphor in the Bible to represent evil and all its destructive power. A good example of this is found in Psalm 89. The psalmist is intent on telling his listeners how great God is, and so as part of his description of God's greatness, he says, "You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rahab like one of the slain. With your strong arm, you scattered your enemies." The mythical sea monster, Rahab, mentioned here, is probably being used by the psalmist as a metaphor for the Egyptian pharaoh who enslaved Israel in Egypt. And thus Rahab being crushed by God may be a poetic reference to the drowning of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea as they were pursuing the Israelites. The idea here is that even the vast, powerful, chaotic sea that threatens to overwhelm us is under God's control. And if he chooses, he can use it as his weapon to defeat his enemies. For the psalmist, the sea and its monsters symbolize any destructive force of chaos and darkness that threatens to take away the lives of his listeners. And he affirms that only God is powerful enough to overcome such a force. God is depicted here and in many other books of the Old Testament as the preserver and protector of life. Indeed, this is a common theme between many of the images of God in the Bible. God as king, God as warrior, God as the bird that protects its young, God as protective husband or as watchful guardian. However, as with all metaphors, this sea metaphor has its obvious limitations. The obvious question here would be, but who created the sea? If, as I mentioned earlier, the writer of Genesis had some idea of a primordial chaos out of which God fashioned order and life, then did God create that chaos? And if so, why? And if he didn't create it, then he can't truly be called the creator of all things, and yet he's depicted as just that throughout the rest of the Bible. But if we argue that this interpretation is incorrect, and that God has indeed created everything that exists, then is he really responsible for creating chaos, and thus the capacity for evil? There's another group of scholars who suggest that the God of Genesis did not in fact create chaos and thus evil, but rather the deep of Genesis 1 is in fact merely one part of God's creative process. In this interpretation, the deep was simply a vast empty ocean which covered all solid ground underneath, and from this empty and formless ocean, waiting like a blank canvas to be used, God created the sky and then parted the waters to reveal the ground underneath. Perhaps we can say, by considering our own experience of life, and indeed the history of humanity, that on those occasions when the situation seemed to be chaotic and disordered and frightening, eventually some kind of order has emerged, if only to preserve human lives which would otherwise have been destroyed by that chaos. And if that's so, then perhaps we can agree to some extent with this alternative interpretation of the biblical metaphor of the sea, which is that the emergence of order and justice and moral norms from the chaos and destruction of evil is part of the ongoing creative work of God. Whether we see God as ultimately the creator of order, who then prevents chaos from overwhelming us, or rather as the God who created the perfect material universe into which came human morality and its notions of good and evil because of sin, we can all probably agree that the chief reason the biblical authors use the sea as a metaphor is because it's a very powerful symbol for human fears. For the Bible writers, those fears included the fear of being overwhelmed by conflict, by change, by foreign invaders and by internal threats. They use the frightening images of the destructive force of the sea to express their great fear of the loss of their way of life, or indeed their fear of death itself, as a result of war, invasion, corruption, crime, or natural disaster. But they also use this symbol of the sea to express their positive belief in an all-powerful God who could calm their fears and bring hope to every situation. They believed in a God who could control the greatest, most powerful natural force that they knew of, the sea, and therefore could certainly help them win victories over their enemies or save them from sickness or drought. Today, with our knowledge of the interconnectedness of the natural world, if we were wanting to express both our fears and our faith in God to save us from them, then perhaps we might choose a different metaphor. Perhaps we would talk about God as the creator of the universe, the creator of galaxies, stars, planets, moons and comets, of atoms, neutrons, protons, quarks. God is the God who protects us from the chaos of radiation and meteors, the Lord of the atmosphere and the ozone layer. But the point of using these images to express our fears is that in doing so we are expressing our need of help in the present situation, and that in turn encourages us to reach out to the one who can help us. And that's what the psalmists did. And even poor Job, in the midst of his misery, he could see that there was no one else who could help him apart from the God who had made the sea and the great creatures within it. And we can only reach out for help if we've already made the decision to trust the person to whom we're reaching out. And if we put our trust and hope in God, even though we may be in the midst of fear and uncertainty, we will find that we will be able to rejoice as we remind ourselves how God has made all things, how he has given us salvation through Christ, and how he has promised to help us when we sail through stormy seas. This was certainly true for the psalmist and for many others in the Bible who were able to rejoice in their relationship with God, regardless of the storm that they might be in. And I'd like to finish with one such piece of rejoicing from Psalm 107. In this psalm, the psalmist tells various stories of how God redeemed and restored his people. And in this particular section, he speaks about those Israelites who went to sea. So this is Psalm 107, verses 23 to 32. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. the waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders. As we continue to live through the storm of this pandemic and its destructive effects, may I encourage you to reach out and put your hope and trust in the only one powerful enough to control the sea and restore order and calm, our Lord Jesus Christ. And it may seem a very strange thing to suggest at this time, but may I also encourage you to take this opportunity to rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice over the memories of the things he's done for us in the past, and rejoice also over what he is doing even now and will do in the future. The Lord travels with us and watches over us and goes ahead of us as we journey on the sea of life. He will keep us safe.